Welcome to Haunted Talks, the official podcast of The Haunted Walk, offering ghost tours and paranormal adventures in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, Ontario. My name is Jim Dean. I am the creative director. It's a great pleasure to have you along for today's show. The Enfield Poltergeist is a case that must give even the most ardent skeptic pause. The story is not only terrifying, but spanning 2 years, it is also one of the most well-documented hauntings in history. There were dozens of first-hand witnesses and hundreds of hours of audio recordings from inside the haunted house, all of which beg the question, how much evidence is enough? In the episode, we will explore the unsettling events and closely examine the key evidence that make the Enfield Poltergeist such a compelling and mysterious case. But before we get to that, we are in the home stretch of our Halloween season now, and it's been great to see so many of you out on tour with us. If you have not gotten your tickets yet for one of our many ghost tours or paranormal adventures taking place, now is the time to get those tickets to make sure you don't miss out. Our Incident at the Bunker, a zombie adventure, which takes place at the Diefenbunker, Canada's Cold War Museum in Carp, Ontario, launches this upcoming weekend. We'll run this weekend and next, and that's where we drop you in the middle of your very own zombie film, of course, deep underground in a Cold War era bunker that we fill with zombies. For zombie enthusiasts, this tour is a must-do. In addition to the many ghost tours we have running in Kingston, Ottawa, and Toronto, we also have our paranormal adventures, the Haunting at Black Creek in Toronto, and the Haunting at Laurier House in Ottawa, for those of you who want a much more creepy and immersive Halloween experience. To get tickets or information about our Halloween season, please visit hauntedwalk.com. And don't forget, as a Haunted Talks listener, you are entitled to a 15% discount by using the promo code Haunted Talks, all one word, Haunted Talks at checkout. We'd also love to connect with you on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Haunted Walk. As you might imagine, we're quite busy on those feeds at this time of year. And if you are enjoying these episodes, please be sure to subscribe to the show, and it is always very helpful to us and fills our cold Halloween hearts with joy when we see those 5-star reviews come in. On the last day of August, in 1977, very strange events began to occur at 284 Green Street in Enfield, England. Built in the 1920s, the very modest semi-detached residence was occupied by recent divorcee Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children, Margaret, 13, Janet, 11, Johnny, 10, and Billy, 7. In the Hodgson House, it seemed to be a normal evening, until Janet and Johnny began calling out for their mother from their shared bedroom. They were frightened and claimed their beds had been shaking as they slept. Mrs. Hodgson calms the children down, only to hear them call out again moments later, frightened by a shuffling sound coming from the dark. She gets them back to bed once more, only to be called back again, as the children have witnessed a chest of drawers slide several feet across the floor. Mrs. Hodgson moved the furniture back in place, only to see it start move again. She tried to push it back. It moved. This happened 3 times. And on the final attempt, she couldn't budge it at all, describing it felt like it was being held by an unseen force. She decides to take the children out of the bedroom, and as she does so, a strange knocking starts occurring throughout the home. Some knocks come from within the walls, others from the ceiling, others below the floorboards. Thinking there must be burglars in the house, Mrs. Hodgson takes all the children to their next-door neighbors, the Nottinghams. Vic Nottingham, a builder, went to investigate, and while he did not discover anyone in the home, he certainly heard the knocking. Completely baffled, they called the police. 2 constables quickly arrived and entered the residence. They too heard the knocking, but could not make sense of it. Then, Constable Carolyn Heaps saw a chair move across the floor. Here is her first-hand account, taken from an interview with the BBC not long after the event occurred.
It came off the floor, or maybe a ½ inch, I should say, and I saw it slide off to the right, about 3.5 to 4 feet before it came to rest. I checked to see whether or not it could possibly have slid along the floor. I placed a marble on the floor to see whether or not the marble would go in the same direction as the chair did, and it didn't roll at all. I checked for wires under the cushion of the chair, and I could find no explanation at all.
With no one in the house, and no crime being committed, the police could not offer much help. Desperate for answers, the family reached out to the Daily Mirror, who immediately dispatched a reporter, Doug Bence, and a photographer, Graham Morris, to look into the happenings. Without observing any activity, the 2 men were set to leave, when Lego, marbles, and other random objects began flying through the air. The photographer was even struck by a piece of Lego in his forehead, which left a mark for several days. Doug Bence, the reporter, stated, "Inside the house, the children's Lego bricks were flying all over the place, going so fast you almost couldn't see them. The kids were screaming, and one of the bricks hit the photographer in the face." Neither man saw anything to lead them to believe the family was responsible for this activity. Graham Morris would later capture the most iconic photos of the haunting. Much of the activity seemed to center around 11-year-old Janet, and would often take place behind closed doors in her bedroom. Graham, not wanting to miss the action, set up a remote-controlled camera so he could snap pictures from downstairs if he heard any commotion coming from the bedroom. One evening, he snapped a series of photos 15 seconds apart. Janet claimed to have been pulled out of her bed and flown around the room. Graham captured several images of Janet, seemingly suspended in midair. To see these photos and several more from the house, check out the link in the show notes or visit hauntedwalk.com/podcasts. Out of concern for the family and unsure how they could help, the reporters contacted the Society for Psychical Research, the world's oldest paranormal research organization, which dates back to 1882. The first investigator to respond was Maurice Gross, a newer member of the SPR that had a background in industrial design and served in World War II. Somewhat eerily, Gross became interested in paranormal research after his daughter, coincidentally also named Janet, had been killed in a motorcycle accident the year before. After his first few days in the house, realizing the scope of the activity, he reached out for additional help and was joined by author and experienced paranormal investigator Guy Lyon Playfair. Over the following months, the investigators would witness over 1,500 unexplainable events, leaving them both convinced the haunting was real. What they also did was make audio recordings, over 200 hours of them on old reel-to-reel tape machines. These included interviews with eyewitnesses, the investigators' observations, and some very unusual activity. Unlike many ghost stories, where the details can start to change a bit over time, these contemporaneous recordings locks certain details of the story into place forever. These recordings are now archived at Cambridge University for all who wish to study them. By the end of October, there had been multiple incidents observed by multiple witnesses in the family, by the neighbors, by visiting family, and the investigators themselves. They included furniture, such as chairs, stools, sofas, and armchairs, turning over by themselves, drawers opening of their own accord, objects in the bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom flying around or moving on their own, unaccounted for knocks and rappings, the appearance of shadowy figures, and crying, whimpering sounds coming from various places in the house. One of the most intriguing recordings made occurred in early November, when Maurice Gross asked the spirit whether it was having a game with him. Immediately, a whooshing sound was heard as a cardboard box was hurled from across the room and hit him square in the face. On the recording, you can hear his shock and the response from others in the room. He is absolutely certain there was no one standing near the box when it flew.
Are you having a game with me? Right.
Oh, crumbs.
As I asked the question, are you having a game with me? It's through the cardboard box and the pillow right in my face.
In mid-November, the situation grew even more troubling, as Janet would start to enter a trance-like state where she would become extremely violent toward herself and others. She also displayed unusual strength in these moments, on one occasion requiring 4 adults to hold her down as she laughed, cried, yelled, and screamed. With the activity showing no signs of stopping, the investigators asked another SPR member and medical doctor, Ian Fletcher, to hypnotize Janet. While in a light sleep, and asked who was responsible for all of this, Janet replied, "Me and my sister," but also added, "I don't know who it is." When asked to describe what it was like to be pulled out of bed, Janet described cold hands wrapping around her body. In the end, Fletcher believed this.
The impression I formed was, this is not fraud. She, and perhaps her sister, are doing some of these things, maybe springing out of bed, but why are they springing out of bed? Something is forcing them to do it against their will.
In the days that followed, the sound of a dog barking and growling was heard from within the house near Janet. The family did not have a dog. Here is Maurice Gross recounting the first time he heard this audio phenomenon.
Let me hear you say my name again. Come on, let me hear you say my name. Come on, my name's Maurice. Let me hear you say it. Maurice.
That was the first time we heard the voice, and since then we've been hearing it again and again, and it's been getting louder and louder.
Gross, seeing an opportunity to commune with the creature or spirit, began to question the growling noise until it began to vocalize English in the voice of a gravelly, elderly man coming from Janet. The voice would curse and complain. It would come to identify itself by several names, but Gross was determined to nail down the spirit's identity. He recruited his son, a lawyer, to cross-examine the ghost. During this incredible interview, the voice relayed that it was the spirit of a former tenant, Bill Wilson, and provided some detailed information about him.
I want you to tell me whether you remember what happened to you when you died.
I went blind. Then I had an hemorrhage and I fell asleep and I died in a chair in a corner downstairs.
Can you tell me where you are at the moment in the room?
On top of Janet.
Why do you sleep on top of Janet?
It's my bed.
Why can't Janet feel you?
I'm invisible.
Why are you invisible?
So my G-H-O-S-T.
Incredibly, upon contacting Bill Wilson's surviving son, the voice's story was corroborated. Terry Wilson confirmed that his father had gone blind, and then one day, while his wife was out shopping, he had sat down in his corner chair, had a hemorrhage, and died. Janet insisted she did not even know what the word hemorrhage actually meant. Activity continued to increase, with the curtains in Janet's bedroom seeming to wrap themselves around her throat several times. These events had multiple witnesses, and once, the force was so strong that it caused the curtain wire to be ripped apart. The family began all sleeping in the same room. Around this time, a major wrinkle in the case occurs. The Hodgson children are caught red-handed trying to trick the investigators. They hit a tape recorder, which they were unaware was still recording. Listening to the audio, you can distinctly hear them say they were going to hide it and blame it on the ghost. And this was not the only time. There were several occasions where one or more of the children were in some way helping to create the phenomena. Despite this, given the other things they had observed, the investigators were not swayed in their belief. In his writings, Maurice Gross addressed the thorny problem of children helping the phenomena along, maintaining that he would have been surprised if the children had not copied the phenomena. However, he insisted it was patently obvious when the events were not genuine. Indeed, he went further and stated, "I can safely say at least 95% of the events that have taken place while I have been present have been genuine." This sentiment is echoed by Janet herself, who in a 2017 interview with Will Storr in The Telegraph was asked about being caught on camera bending spoons with her hands. "I remember that one," Janet said, blushing. "Maurice was annoyed with me. Why did you fake things?" There were times when things would happen and times when they wouldn't. Sometimes, if things didn't happen, you'd somehow feel you'd failed. So you felt obliged to make things up so people wouldn't be skeptical of you? That's pretty much it. Plus, you'd get bored and frustrated at all the people coming and going. I mean, life wasn't normal. How much of the phenomena at Enfield was faked? Janet looked into her lap. I'd say 2%. Arguably, one might suggest that many of the eyewitnesses, the family, the investigators, the neighbors, may have had something to gain from the notoriety of the case, whether it be financial or just in the sense of some fame and recognition. However, there were two witnesses who had no connection to the family who had observed something unusual at 284 Green Street. Hazel Short, an adult crossing guard, and John Rainbow, who worked as a baker and made deliveries, both observed extremely similar events 5 days apart in December of 1977. Here is John Rainbow's testimony from an interview with Maurice Gross, transcribed by Dr. Melvin Willen in his book, The Enfield Poltergeist Tapes. On December 15th, 1977, as a local tradesman doing my deliveries in Green Street, I noticed a red cushion on the roof of number 284. At the time, I was between 1 and 200 yards away from the house. One moment, when I looked, there was no cushion on the roof, and the next moment, the cushion was there. It just seemed to appear on the edge of the roof. As far as I was aware, the windows of the bedroom upstairs were closed, and they opened outwards. I don't think it was possible for the cushion to be thrown onto the roof. On arriving outside number 284, as I served the people next door in 286, there was something very strange going on in the bedroom of 284. The family in there were not customers of mine, and I only know them by sight. Normally, I would have just served the customer in 286, and then I would have immediately left. But on this particular day, I stood outside the house, as there was a considerable amount of noise coming from the bedroom in number 284. There were loud knocking and banging noises coming from the bedroom. As the cushion was on the roof, it was a very unusual situation. I could see quite clearly into the room, for although one of the curtains was only partially drawn back, the other curtain was drawn right back, and the window was clear. The windows were closed, but the curtains were blowing back into the room, as though there was a very strong draft blowing through the windows. The order in which the events occurred were as follows. I saw the child, whom I now know to be Janet, well inside the room, and in the first instance, I saw her head bobbing up and down, just as if she was bouncing up and down on her bed. Then articles came swiftly across the room towards the window. They were definitely not thrown at the window, as the articles were going around in a circle, hitting the window and then bounce off to continue at the same height in a clockwise direction. If the articles had been thrown, they would have just hit the window and fallen down. The articles appeared to be books, dolls, and linen articles. There were 5 or 6 articles, and by their movement acted as though they were attached to a piece of elastic. They appeared to be traveling with considerable force, and all of the articles were going around at the same time. The child then appeared, on 2 occasions, floating horizontally across the room, and twice her arm banged forcibly against the window. I was frightened at the time that the child would come right through. At the same time, as the articles were going around the room, the curtains were blowing up. The whole episode was very violent, and I was very upset and disturbed at what I saw. Very soon after the episode, I was outside the house talking to someone about these strange events when Janet came out. She looked vacant, and certainly not like a child who had just been playing about. Over the next year, countless professors, paranormal investigators, and mediums all came to visit the home, including Ed and Lorraine Warren, and the Enfield Poltergeist is the inspiration for the movie The Conjuring 2. You can only imagine how disruptive having all of these people in and out of the house would be. Eventually, with no end of the occurrences in sight, Janet was taken to hospital, where she remained for testing and observation for 6 weeks, and then declared quite normal. Gradually, the events began to taper off, completely ending by 1979. Janet has gone on to live a fairly regular life, except for occasional notoriety connected to the case. Janet's mum, Peggy Hodgson, continued to live in the house up until the time of her death in 2003. There were skeptics then, as there are today, in regards to the Enfield case. In the face of all of the information I have just shared with you, some still believe that the simplest and most likely explanation is that Janet, who was caught red-handed, and others, including some of her family members and or neighbors, were responsible for the events. Heavy objects were intentionally knocked over, light ones were thrown through the air, walls were secretly knocked upon, and a fake voice was created. Skeptic Chris French, who we had on the show way back in episode 5, also points out that once there is a suggestion that a house is haunted, we suddenly perceive mundane and otherwise unnoticed things as threatening. We are, in a sense, amped up. He also makes the point that eyewitness testimony, even from external sources like John Rainbow, are very prone to error and being substantially influenced. If for a moment we take the skeptical view and believe the Enfield Poltergeist was a hoax, what things would then be true? Despite the fact that key eyewitnesses have never changed their stories about what occurred, one or more of them must be lying. The reasons the family and neighbors would choose to lie are not abundantly clear, as the results of the activity in the house and the attention it drew were not obviously beneficial to anyone. In fact, it seemed quite the opposite. Whichever parties were perpetrating these acts were extremely committed to them over the span of 2 years. Not only would they have to be committed to them, but they would need to have enough skill and ability to routinely pull off intricate pranks without getting caught. Could members of a struggling single-parent family invest the time and energy to create this kind of show? It would also mean that Janet had acquired significant ventriloquism skills to produce the voice. It would also require her to use that fake gravelly part of her voice for stretches of up to 2 to 3 hours in length, without showing any sign of a sore throat or hoarseness. And I would encourage you to try for yourself to speak with that low gravelly voice and just see how long you can do it. It would also mean that the audio and photographic evidence, as well as all of the eyewitness testimonies, should not be believed. They are either intentionally deceitful or accidentally so through suggestion. The speed and strength with which the Enfield Poltergeist took over life at 284 Green Street is the stuff of nightmares. All we are left with is the seemingly unanswerable question: was it real, or was it a terrifying hoax? Because something was certainly happening in that house.
The pub check you down the street. Merrily, lobby concentrate. Now smile.
If you are interested in learning more about the Enfield Poltergeist, there are several excellent documentaries from the BBC and Channel 4, and I would highly recommend Dr. Melville Willen's book, The Enfield Poltergeist Tapes, perhaps the most detailed examination of the audio evidence itself. Thanks so much for joining us for the show. Information about our Halloween season can be found at our website, which is hauntedwalk.com. And be sure to use the promo code HauntedTalks at checkout, all one word, to get 15% off your tickets. If you are enjoying the episodes, be sure to subscribe so you know when the new ones are coming out, and a 5-star review would certainly be a nice treat for our trick-or-treat bag. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all 3 at Haunted Walk. And as always, thank you to our Haunted Talks team, including Michelle Dennis, our outstanding audio editor, and Ezra Badeau for the additional research. And to Kevin MacLeod and Incompetech.com for the additional music. Until we meet again, sweet dreams.